Hey guys, this is Kristen McMasters with the Liberty Bell channel. I am excited to be talking with y'all about some current events that have been going on. So I wrote an article called, I actually don't remember the name of it. It's a constitutional perspective on the Trump indictment. Now, I don't really like to spend a lot of time talking about current events and getting really partisan about it or turning the discussions into these sort of controversial discussions. Number one, I don't really buy into what the media circus is really getting into, because typically if the media and politicians are spending a lot of time on something, that something is just a distraction from other things that are more important, or it's just a method of trying to stir up our emotions and get us to do something simply because that's what they want. So I don't really like to buy into that. That being said, because the Trump indictment is such a big situation, is so salient right now, I did want to at least comment on it from a constitutional perspective. So I'm going to briefly, I have not memorized this, so I don't know this by heart, so I'm going to briefly sort of read through the news story or the situation surrounding the Trump indictment, so that we have a little context, especially if you've heard of the Trump indictment but you don't actually know the specifics regarding the case. And then I'm going to discuss some aspects of it from a constitutional perspective or viewpoint. Okay, so long story short, a grand jury in New York has voted to indict former President Trump. Now, I, generally speaking, have an idea of what indict meant or was, but I wasn't 100% sure I knew exactly what that meant, so I looked it up, and this is the definition. It's to charge with a crime in due form by law by the finding of a presentment of a grand jury, to bring an indictment against. It is the peculiar province of a grand jury to indict, as it is of a House of Representatives to impeach. So there is something unique about indictment in that a grand jury is the only group of people that can choose to indict someone. No one else has that power, nothing else. So what are the charges? Apparently nobody knows the details, or the details haven't been released to the public. But based on the research that I did, and I do want to make sure I clarify something, this is all in state court. So this is New York State Court in New York State law. Okay, and so this is not a federal law violation. This is dealing with state law violations. So this is all handled within the state of New York. All right, so Trump is accused of paying hush money, specifically $130,000, to adult film star Stormy Daniels during the 2016 campaign season in order to keep her from making any public statements or criticisms of Trump at the time. So Trump's lawyer, or ex-lawyer, I should say, Michael Cohen, supposedly funded this payment through a home equity line of credit, and then Trump paid him back in large payments over the next few months, citing the payments as a legal expense. While much of the accused behaviors sound immoral, the real question is what laws have been broken and subsequently what crimes have been committed. That's what I was curious about. So I found one explanation explaining specifically what crimes would have been Trump would be guilty of should he be found guilty. So under New York law, again this is dealing with state law, disguising such payments in corporate records is a crime, but typically only a misdemeanor. It becomes a felony if the false business records were intended to obscure a second crime. In this case, the second crime appears to be the use of funds to advance Trump's presidential campaign, allegedly in violation of campaign finance laws. Okay, so that's sort of the story. I'm not saying that I'm not giving credence to this story one way or the other. In other words, this is what the media is saying, so this is what I'm saying. I'm sure there's a lot more going on than we're getting told. All right. So when I kind of researched this situation a little bit more, it brought up some thoughts for me about the Constitution and the requirements for president. So what I'm going to look at is the constitutional requirements for president and the uniqueness of the United States and the requirements that we put on candidates for not just president, but really for any position in the federal government. So the Constitution in Article 2, which deals with the executive branch, Section 1, Clause 5, this is what the Constitution says about someone running for presidential office. So no person except a natural-born citizen, so you have to be born here in this country, or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution. And that just means when the Constitution was written, even if you weren't born in the country, you were still eligible to be president at that time in the 1780s and 90s and 1800s, is if you were living in the United States at the time of the Constitution's ratification. I hope that makes sense. So that's what that little phrase means. shall be eligible for the office of president. Neither shall any person be eligible to the office who shall not have attained to the age of 35, so you have to be 35, and been 14 years a resident within the United States. Okay, so that's the comprehensive list of qualifications an individual must meet in order to become president, which to me is pretty remarkable. And I don't think we really think about this very much. So a lot of us tend to look at somebody running for president and look at their education background, look at their job, experience, all of these different things. But the founders literally put 3 qualifications on somebody running for office of president. You have to be 35, you have to have lived in the United States for 14 years, and you have to have been born here. Now, the reason for the living here for 14 years and the having been born here is because of something that, if you've watched any other of my videos, it's attached to a theory called virtue, which comes from Montesquieu, which basically means there has to be a really strongly ingrained love of the law in a person. So there has to be a deeply held respect, understanding, and appreciation for the country, the values of the country, the Constitution itself, the values behind the Constitution. The founders didn't believe that something like that virtue, could have ever been attained if you didn't live here, and apparently if you weren't born here. So they put those 2 stipulations on there, because that's the most important thing. If you're going to be in government, you better have sort of the deep understanding and respect for the way our government functions and the Constitution works in you. So we've got those 2 requirements, and then you have to be 35. That's it, though, okay? So I want this to really set in, because I think we don't really think about this as American citizens. There are no gender requirements. There are no race requirements. In fact, if you look at the language of the Constitution, it says person. It doesn't even use gendered pronouns. There's no prior experience requirements. There's no education requirements. There's no wealth requirements, status or class requirements, military experience requirements, which is interesting given the fact that the president is going to be the, basically the head of the military. There's no religious requirements. There's no legal requirements. There's no physical or health requirements. So you can have cancer and run for president. If you know anything about American history, FDR ran for president and he was confined to a wheelchair, and most people didn't even know that was the case. There are no other requirements than the requirements I just explained. All right. So the position, and you'll notice all government positions created by the Constitution, for any of the other branches, the federal branches, was meant to be for any and every citizen, regardless of sex, race, education, and the like. The founders wanted to go the polar opposite direction of what they'd experienced in England and their class society, their noble blood, and their lack of access for most people. There's also the potential for grace in the process. So someone can have had a rough past and still run for political office. They can still run for the job of president. This is really interesting. In this country, a convicted felon can become president of the United States, or a member of Congress, or someone on the Supreme Court. Get that? In this country, a convicted felon can run for president. So that's where I really started thinking about, where does this whole Trump indictment situation fall in line with what we're talking about with the Constitution? And I give you this account because it's incredibly unique that Trump can be indicted, potentially found guilty of a crime, and still be eligible to be president of the United States. And the reason that this is so unique is because the founders decided to, instead of trying to put eligibility restrictions and requirements in the Constitution, they decided to let the people be the eligibility requirements. Get that? We possess the choice of whether or not to bestow grace. We're the ones who are the judge of who we are willing to put into political office. We are the ones vetting and looking at the candidates for political office and making these decisions. If we don't want someone because of a lack of education, or because of a lack of job experience, or because of race, or because of gender, or because of criminal past history, we get to make that decision. We're the ones that can bestow grace or not. We're the ones that can look at Trump's situation and say, we don't want him in office because he has this criminal background or potential criminal background. Or we can say, we're okay with that, and we're going to give him the opportunity. We get to make that call. That's the key point here. The Constitution allows anyone to run, regardless of past, regardless of anything. You get to run as long as you're 35, you're born here, and you've been here for 14 years. You have the chance to run for President of the United States. So I hope that kind of puts this situation into perspective and the uniqueness of the way that we handle government. Government was never supposed to be made up of these elite people who were not connected to the citizens. It was always supposed to be of the people, by the people, for the people, right? Connected to us because they are made up of us. all right? And it was never supposed to be people there forever and ever and ever, and that's a whole nother thing that we can talk about. But it was always supposed to be us up there serving the rest of us, right? And so even the position of president is that way. So you can be a convicted felon. The problem that really sort of comes into play in this is that the Constitution presumes upon the citizenry so much knowledge and so much wisdom in this regard. So I'm going to read this quote to conclude. So de Tocqueville, who was he's an author of a book called Democracy in America, if you notice this fly here, he said, "But when one examines the Constitution of the United States, the best of all known federal constitutions, it is frightening to see how much diverse knowledge and discernment it assumes on the part of the citizenry." Did you get that? It's frightening just how much this Constitution assumes diverse knowledge and discernment on our part, right? So I'm going to read this last paragraph of mine because I think it's really going to hammer in the point that I want to make. So the amount of knowledge and wisdom the Constitution assumes on behalf of the citizenry here is indeed staggering. The Electoral College process for president tempers the power of the citizenry to a degree, but we still hold the bulk of the power here. Truly, for all positions in the federal government, the constitutional qualifications are so few that it is truly up to the citizenry to decide who we believe is qualified to fill these positions. The amount of trust the framers put into the citizenry to know the Constitution, understand the government, its limitations, how it ought to work, and who is best equipped and best qualified to fill its chambers is truly remarkable. And so I end my blog post, and I'm going to end this video with this question. Are we truly worthy of such trust and responsibility, or have we all but forfeited that right to be so entrusted? And that's something I think we should all consider. Are we truly worthy of this trust, or are we not? And I think the whole Trump situation is one of those things that sort of brings that to light. So check into my next video because I'm going to be talking about the gun debate. And I hope that this was informative for you.